The emergency meeting was called for 6 a.m., but French Ambassador Philippe Lalliot arrived at the presidential palace in Ouagadougou at 5:47 a.m., clearly hoping to catch Ibrahim Traoré off guard. What the veteran diplomat didn't know was that Traoré had been awake all night, reviewing classified intelligence reports that would destroy not just Lalliot's career, but France's entire relationship with Burkina Faso. As Lalliot settled into his chair with the confidence of a man representing a former colonial power, Traoré slid a manila envelope across the desk, containing photographs that would send shockwaves through the Élysée Palace within hours. "Ambassador," Traoré said quietly, his voice carrying a chill that made Lalliot's smile falter. "We need to discuss your recent activities that go far beyond normal diplomatic duties." But what Lalliot didn't know was that hidden cameras were already recording every word, every gesture, every drop of sweat that would soon appear on the ambassador's forehead. And in exactly 13 minutes, this footage would be broadcast live to every major news network in the world. Traoré had pressed a button under his desk, activating not just the recording equipment, but also a secure communication system that alerted intelligence agencies across Africa. This wasn't just a diplomatic meeting. It was the opening shot in a war that France didn't even know had already begun. Traoré opened the envelope and placed the first image on the desk. Lalliot's eyes widened as he recognized the aerial photograph. French military personnel in civilian clothes entering a chemical facility in Ouagadougou at 2:00 a.m. 3 days earlier. "Can you explain why French operatives were infiltrating our water treatment plant, Ambassador?" Traoré asked. But before Lalliot could answer, Traoré revealed something that made the ambassador's blood freeze. "Or perhaps you'd prefer to explain why they were carrying containers marked with Russian chemical symbols." Lalliot's mouth opened to protest, but Traoré wasn't finished. He placed a second photograph on the desk, this one taken inside the French embassy compound, showing boxes of chemicals with Cyrillic writing. "These were photographed in your embassy basement yesterday," Traoré said calmly. "Russian nerve agents, stored in the diplomatic compound of our supposed ally." What Lalliot didn't know was that these chemicals had been planted there by French intelligence, not to use against Burkina Faso, but to frame Russia for what France was about to do. "But I'm curious about something else," Traoré continued, placing a third photograph on the desk. This one showed Lalliot himself, shaking hands with a man in the shadows outside a restaurant in Ouagadougou. "Do you recognize this person, Ambassador?" Lalliot's face went pale as he stared at the image. The man in the photograph was Colonel Hassan Diarra, Burkina Faso's head of presidential security. "Colonel Diarra has been providing you with my personal schedule, my food preferences, even my medical records," Traoré revealed. "The question is, why would France need such intimate details about my daily routine?" But Traoré's next revelation would explain everything. He placed a USB drive on the desk and connected it to his laptop, projecting audio waveforms onto the wall screen. "This recording was made in Colonel Diarra's office 3 days ago," Traoré announced, pressing play. Lalliot's own voice filled the room. "The operation must look natural. Heart attack, stroke, sudden illness, anything that won't raise suspicions. But it needs to happen before the AU summit next week." The ambassador's face went ashen as he heard his own words condemning him. "You were planning to assassinate me," Traoré stated matter-of-factly. "But that's not even the most shocking part." Traoré opened his laptop and displayed a document that would later be called the most damning evidence of modern French neo-colonialism. A detailed list of 247 names. "This is your target list, Ambassador. Not just me, but my entire cabinet, key military officers, religious leaders, and prominent business owners who support independence." He scrolled through the names, each one representing a life that France had marked for elimination. "But here's what's truly diabolical," Traoré continued. "You weren't planning individual assassinations. You were planning to poison the water supplied during next week's African Union summit, when all these leaders would be in Ouagadougou." Lalliot finally found his voice. "Mr. President, I don't know where you're getting this information, but from your own communications," Traoré interrupted, displaying encrypted messages on the screen, including this one from President Macron himself. sent yesterday at 11:47 p.m. The message read, Sahel Reset Phase 3 approved. Eliminate all obstacles. Biological agent authorized. Make it look like Ebola outbreak. The plan was beyond assassination. It was genocide disguised as a natural disaster. What you don't know, Ambassador, is that Colonel Diarra has been working for us all along, Traoré revealed. Every piece of information he gave you was designed to expose your operation. Lalliot's confident demeanor completely collapsed as he realized he had been played from the beginning. The chemicals in your embassy? We put them there, the infiltration of our water plant? We let it happen so we could document it. This entire operation has been a trap. But Traoré wasn't finished exposing the scope of French treachery. He displayed a network diagram showing connections between French operatives and contacts across Africa. Operation Sahel Reset isn't just about Burkina Faso, he explained. You're planning similar operations in Mali, Niger, Chad, and Senegal. Mass elimination of independent-minded leaders across the entire region. The scale of the conspiracy was breathtaking. France was planning to literally decapitate African leadership across the Sahel. And here's why, Traoré said, displaying financial projections. Resource extraction contracts worth $800 billion over the next decade, but only if you can install puppet governments that will reverse our nationalization policies. The assassination plot wasn't about politics, it was about money. $800 billion worth of African resources that France was willing to commit genocide to control. Suddenly, red lights appeared on cameras around the room as international news networks went live. Lalliot looked around in horror as he realized their entire conversation had been broadcast to the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Traoré addressed the cameras, you've just witnessed a French ambassador being confronted with evidence of his government's plan to commit genocide in Africa. The diplomatic immunity that Lalliot had counted on evaporated as millions of viewers watched him being exposed as a war criminal. Everything you've seen today will be released publicly within the hour, Traoré announced. Every document, every recording, every photograph. The world will see exactly what France calls diplomatic relations. But Traoré had saved the most damaging evidence for last, including this video call between President Macron and his defense minister, recorded 2 days ago. The screen filled with grainy video footage of Macron in his office. The African experiment with independence ends now. Use whatever methods necessary. History will vindicate us. Ambassador Lalliot, Traoré said, standing up with presidential authority. You have exactly 24 hours to leave Burkina Faso. Every French diplomatic personnel, every French intelligence operative, every French military advisor gone. But the ultimatum came with an even more devastating consequence. Furthermore, any French citizen found in Burkina Faso after that deadline will be arrested as a suspected terrorist and handed over to the International Criminal Court. All French assets in Burkina Faso are hereby frozen, Traoré continued. All French companies are nationalized. All French aid agreements are terminated. The economic implications were staggering. France would lose billions overnight. And we're calling on every African nation to take similar measures until France renounces its genocide plans. Lalliot, realizing his career and possibly his freedom were over, made a desperate attempt at intimidation. Mr. President, if you proceed with this, France will destroy your economy. We'll isolate you internationally. Ambassador, Traoré interrupted coldly. France just tried to commit genocide against my people. I think we're already at war. As if on cue, security personnel entered the room, escorting a man in handcuffs. It was Dr. Michel Dubois, the French embassy's medical officer. Dr. Dubois was arrested 1 hour ago attempting to introduce biological agents into our water supply, Traoré announced. He's already confessed to being part of Operation Sahel Reset. The plan had been real, immediate, and already in motion. Traoré played a video of Dubois' confession. The plan was to introduce a modified Ebola virus into water supplies during the AU summit. It would kill the target individuals within 72 hours, but looked like a natural outbreak. The premeditated nature of the biological attack sent shockwaves through the international audience. Traoré's phone buzzed with an urgent message from his foreign minister. Paris going crazy. Macron calling emergency meeting. French military on alert. The exposure of Operation Sahel Reset was triggering panic at the highest levels of the French government. What France doesn't understand, Traoré told the cameras, is that African leaders have been coordinating secretly for months. We knew this attack was coming. He displayed a map showing allied African nations. 14 countries are simultaneously expelling French ambassadors and freezing French assets as we speak. But Traoré wasn't finished with his public humiliation of French diplomacy. Furthermore, all French companies operating in Burkina Faso are hereby nationalized. All French assets are frozen, and Burkina Faso is withdrawing from every international organization where France holds permanent membership. The economic implications were staggering. France would lose billions of dollars in African investments overnight. Lalliot made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Mr. President, if you proceed with this course of action, France will consider it an act of war. We have the power to destroy your economy, isolate you internationally, and— Ambassador, Traoré interrupted with a smile that contained no warmth. France just tried to poison my entire government. I think we're already at war. As if on cue, Colonel Diallo entered the room with a team of armed guards. Mr. President, we've just received confirmation that French special forces attempted to infiltrate our water treatment facilities 1 hour ago. They were captured with chemical weapons. The revelation that France had actually begun implementing their assassination plot sent shockwaves through the room and the international audience watching live. Lalliot's last vestiges of diplomatic immunity evaporated as evidence mounted that France had moved from planning to active implementation of a mass assassination plot. Ambassador, Traoré said, his patience finally exhausted, your government attempted to commit genocide against my people. You will leave now, or you will be arrested as an accessory to attempted mass murder. Faced with the choice between immediate departure and international prosecution for war crimes, Lalliot chose to leave. But the real fireworks began when news of the expulsion reached Paris. President Macron's reaction was swift, explosive, and ultimately self-destructive. Within hours of Lalliot's departure, Macron held an emergency press conference where he made the catastrophic error of confirming much of what Traoré had revealed. Burkina Faso's actions are completely unacceptable, Macron declared. France has legitimate interests in ensuring regional stability, and we will not allow radical elements to threaten the international order we have worked to build. The phrase legitimate interests in ensuring regional stability was immediately interpreted as confirmation that France had indeed been planning intervention in Burkina Faso. But Macron's most damaging statement came when a journalist asked about the assassination allegations. France has always reserved the right to protect its interests through whatever means necessary, he replied. We will not apologize for taking decisive action against threats to regional peace. The statement was so close to an admission of assassination plotting that it triggered immediate calls for Macron's resignation from opposition parties in France. The international reaction was swift and devastating for France. The African Union called an emergency session and voted to condemn what they termed attempted genocide by a former colonial power. The United Nations Security Council scheduled hearings on France's actions. Even traditional French allies began distancing themselves from what looked increasingly like state-sponsored terrorism. But perhaps the most damaging response came from other African nations. Within 48 hours of Traoré's revelation, 6 African countries had expelled their French ambassadors. 14 others had frozen French assets and nationalized French companies. The Ouagadougou effect, as international media dubbed it, spread across Africa like wildfire. France's entire continental strategy collapsed in less than a week. The economic impact on France was catastrophic. French companies lost an estimated $50 billion in African assets within the first month. The Paris Stock Exchange plummeted as investors fled French multinationals with African exposure, but the political impact was even more severe. Macron's approval ratings collapsed to historic lows as the French public learned that their government had attempted to poison African leaders. Opposition parties called for impeachment proceedings, and mass protests erupted across France. 3 months after the expulsion, Agent Claire Dubois testified before the International Criminal Court, providing detailed evidence of French planning for mass assassination in Burkina Faso. Her testimony led to international arrest warrants for several high-ranking French officials, including former Ambassador Lalliot. The revelation that a modern European democracy had planned genocide against African leaders sent shockwaves through the international community and fundamentally altered perceptions of neo-colonial relationships. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was the transformation of Ibrahim Traoré from a regional leader into a continental hero. His courage in exposing France's assassination plot inspired other African leaders to take stronger stances against foreign interference. 1 year after the explosive expulsion, Traoré addressed the United Nations General Assembly about the incident. His speech, titled "When Diplomacy Becomes Terrorism," was watched by millions and fundamentally changed international law regarding diplomatic immunity. The world learned that diplomatic credentials do not protect those who plan genocide, Traoré told the Assembly. France's attempt to poison my government crossed every line of international law and human decency. The speech received standing ovations from developing nations worldwide, but the most powerful moment came when Traoré displayed the original target list with 200 names marked for assassination. "These are not just names on a list," he said, as the Assembly sat in stunned silence. "These are fathers, mothers, leaders, and citizens whose only crime was believing in African independence." But the ultimate vindication of Traoré's actions came when the International Court of Justice ruled that France's actions constituted attempted genocide and ordered reparations to Burkina Faso. The court's decision established new precedents for diplomatic immunity and confirmed that planning mass assassination was not protected diplomatic activity. 2 years after Philippe Lalliot's humiliating expulsion, France remained diplomatically isolated across much of Africa. The ambassador, who had arrived for a routine breakfast, had triggered the largest diplomatic crisis in Franco-African relations since independence. But for Ibrahim Traoré, the most important outcome wasn't international recognition or legal vindication. It was the knowledge that his people were alive because he had chosen courage over diplomacy. The water supplies that France had planned to poison now flowed safely to schools and hospitals across Burkina Faso. The leaders who had been marked for assassination continued to serve their people, and the independence that France had tried to destroy had become stronger than ever. The breakfast meeting that was supposed to last 30 minutes had lasted 17 minutes and changed African history forever. And the ambassador who had arrived, thinking he represented a superior power, had left knowing that the era of French dominance in Africa was finally ending. The cameras that had captured Lalliot's humiliation had also captured the birth of a new Africa, one that would no longer tolerate foreign powers who confused diplomacy with terrorism, and leaders who understood that true sovereignty sometimes required telling former colonial masters exactly where they could go. And as the sun set over Ouagadougou on the day of Lalliot's expulsion, children played safely in streets that France had planned to turn into scenes of mass murder, protected by a president who had chosen their lives over diplomatic convenience. The explosion Macron had promised had indeed come, but it had destroyed French influence in Africa rather than Burkina Faso's independence.